Good morning and welcome back to the Japan Society's regular webinar on current affairs and business for our first such event of 2021. Happy New Year, Shinnen Akemashite Omedetou. I am Bill Emmott and I have the honor and pleasure of chairing the Japan Society. We are all, I imagine, happy to have escaped from 2020, but naturally wonder what this year will bring, as well as about the longer term future. And that is our topic today. Climate and the hoped-for path to a decarbonized future. Both the British and the Japanese governments have recently pledged that our countries will achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, joining many other countries that have done so. China, the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, has significantly pledged to reach this target by 2060. Can it be done? And how? How optimistic should we be? The past 5 years since the Paris Accord on Climate was signed have been the hottest on record. That Paris Accord was much criticized for being rather weak, and yet even so, Donald Trump still withdrew America from it. And when the country in which the accord was signed, France, proposed to introduce higher carbon taxes on fuel, it sparked off the nationwide long-running protests by the so-called Gilets jaunes, which pushed Emmanuel Macron's government badly off course. And now we have had a year of the COVID pandemic with more to come. This showed the effect of economic shutdown on pollution levels, but also has imposed huge costs on governments, households, and private companies alike. At such a time of economic and potentially political strain, can climate action really be made a priority, or are governments just paying lip service to this? But let us also recognize some notes of optimism. The managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, told the Financial Times earlier this week that 2021 will be, quotes, the transformative year towards the climate economy. There is a new receptiveness towards public investment, at least in the rich world, which could facilitate necessary infrastructural change. The International Energy Agency last October, in its annual energy outlook, described solar power as, quotes, the cheapest electricity in history. And today, as we all know, Joe Biden will be inaugurated as President of the United States, and one of his first acts will be to rejoin the Paris Accord. In November, the UK will chair the next UN Climate Change Conference, COP26. Where are we? What can be done? And what must the immediate priorities be? To address these questions, we are truly fortunate to welcome two leading experts from the UK and Japan on this issue. In the UK, I welcome Adair Turner, an economist and public servant who's done an array of important jobs, including leading the CBI, the Low Pay Commission, and the Financial Services Authority, as well as being the first chairman of the UK's Climate Change Committee, but who now, as well as sitting in the House of Lords, is chairing the Energy Transitions Commission, an international think tank based in London. In Japan, I welcome Dr. Naoko Ishii, who has similarly had a distinguished career in public service, chiefly in the Ministry of Finance, including as Deputy Vice Minister, but also at the World Bank and the IMF. From 2012 to 2020, she was Chief Executive and Chair of the Global Environment Facility, the funding body attached to the World Bank, and then returned to Tokyo as the inaugurating director of a new entity at the University of Tokyo, the Center for Global Commons. As usual, each of our speakers will open with 10 minutes of remarks, following which we will have a discussion and, most important of all, your questions. As usual, please submit questions using the Q&A function and do vote for other people's questions if you'd like me to spot them. Today, I'm going to ask Adair Turner to begin in the UK, given that we are chairing COP26 this year. Welcome to the Japan Society, Adair. Over to you.
Bill, thank you very much indeed, and good morning, everybody, or good evening in Japan. I would like to give a global perspective on how we can get to net zero, and then make some comments specifically on the UK situation. And as I talk, as Bill has said, as chair of an organization called the Energy Transition Commission, which, although we have our base in London, is actually a global coalition of mainly companies, but some NGOs from across the world. So we include companies from fossil fuel companies like BP and Shell and major European electricity companies like Iberdrola and Ørsted, but we also include steel and cement companies in India, Tata Steel and Dalmia Cement, and we include major companies in China as well, the biggest wind turbine manufacturer in the world, Envision, and the biggest solar PV manufacturer in the world, Longji Solar. There are about 40 of these companies now members, and it is continuing to grow. We came together 5 years ago, just after the Paris Agreement, and all of our members are committed to the fact that we must meet the objectives of the Paris Climate Agreement to keep global temperature increase to below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally to only 1.5 degrees centigrade. And increasingly, we've focused on that 1.5. In order to do that, we need to get the emissions from the energy and industrial systems of our societies down to zero, net zero by mid-century. And the interpretation we've had of that is that all rich, developed economies should get to zero by 2050 and all developing by 2060 at the latest. And I'm very pleased that Japan, by a commitment of the Prime Minister about 2 months ago, and the UK, and Korea, for instance, and the European Union, and after this afternoon, US, are all committed to that, all developed rich countries, zero by 2050. The work of the Energy Transition Commission is fundamentally on how do you do that? Is it technologically possible? Is it economically possible? And what public policy is required to support to get there? And the optimistic message that we give is that it is absolutely possible to get to net zero by mid-century, and that the economic costs are really very small indeed. And the reason why I'm so confident about that is that there's been a technological revolution and a cost revolution over the last 10 years, and Bill has already referred to it in that IEA statement. We have seen these unbelievable falls in the cost of solar and wind energy. Solar PV costs down 80 or 90%, onshore wind down 60 or 70%, offshore wind, and this is important for Japan, now coming down by equally dramatic amounts, batteries that we can use to balance the system down by 85% in 10 years. This is a major change in the facts that we face. And what it means is that we can now set out to build electricity systems which are basically fundamentally based, primarily based on variable renewables. We can use those variable renewables to produce probably 80 or 85% of our electricity, and that we can have systems where the total system cost, including the backup and the storage and the flexibility, the total system cost is fully competitive with existing fossil fuel systems. And that's what our reports of the ETC set out. Now, it's true to say that it does vary by country. Actually, Japan is one country which has a bigger challenge in producing a decarbonized electricity system because of its geography, its topography. It's not the greatest place for solar PV. Its mountainous nature makes it more difficult for some categories of onshore wind. And so offshore may be crucial in Japan, and the developments of floating offshore may be a crucial answer to the fact that the sea gets pretty deep pretty quickly off the coast of Japan. So it does vary. The situation in Japan is more challenging. The situation in Morocco it's as easy as anything to decarbonize electricity production at a cost which will be a quarter of the cost of a fossil fuel system. But on average over the world, you can do it. And so at the core of our strategy for decarbonizing the economy is to electrify as much as possible. And there are some sectors of the economy that we know how to electrify. We will electrify them. And once we've done it, the cost to consumers will be nil. Indeed, they will be getting, for instance, road transport services cheaper than they do at the moment. But there are some other sectors of the economy which are more difficult. We called these the hard to abate sectors. And 2.5 years ago, in 2018, the ETC produced a landmark report, which has had quite a major influence, called our Mission Possible report, where we looked at how do you decarbonize steel, chemicals, cement, long distance aviation, long distance shipping. These are the hard to abate sectors. But even in these hard to abate sectors, there are technological routes to zero carbon. I won't go through them in detail, but very happy to come back to them in questions afterwards. But sometimes it is using electricity. Sometimes it's using carbon capture and storage. Sometimes it's using bioenergy, though being very careful to make sure that we're not destroying rainforests to build bioenergy. Often it is hydrogen. Hydrogen is going to be a very major vector of decarbonization of these hard to abate sectors. I had no idea I would say this 5 years ago, but the future of long distance shipping is probably to burn ammonia in ship engines. The ammonia comes from hydrogen, and the hydrogen can be zero carbon if you make it from electrolysis of water using renewable energy. So we have a clear vision that we can get to net zero by 2050, but it won't happen automatically. It still needs public policy support. It needs, for instance, public policy support to drive the development of the hydrogen economy faster than it would otherwise occur. The way I sometimes sum it up is, I'm actually completely confident that by 2080, 2100, we will have a zero carbon economy. There is tons of solar energy up there. We will be buying our energy cheaper than we are at the moment, and it will be much better in all sorts of ways. The challenge is that we've got to do it by 2050, not 2080. And that's the public policy challenge, to accelerate what would occur in any case. Now, in the UK, I was, as Bill said, the first chair of the UK's Climate Change Committee, which is a committee set up by our Act of Parliament to oversee the UK's path to a zero carbon economy. Initially, back in 2008, the legislated target was an 80% reduction, but we now shifted that to a 100% reduction in legislation, which went through in 2019. And the UK Climate Change Committee, under its new chair and new leadership, has just produced a report on where we have to get to by 2035, or in order to be on path to zero by 2050. And one particular feature of it is the near complete decarbonisation of the electricity system by 2035. The crucial thing one has to understand is that a zero carbon economy is a deeply electrified economy. Even in rich developed economies, we will probably use 2.5, 3 times as much electricity as we do today in 2050. In places like India, they'll use 6 times as much electricity. In places like Africa, 15 times. Electrification is the future, whether that electricity is used directly or to make hydrogen. And therefore, it's crucial, as the Climate Change Committee said in the UK, first to get your electricity system decarbonised, because that is the base on which all the other decarbonisations work. Just one final thought. Back in 2008, when we worked out, well, let me go further back. Back in 2000, the UK's Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution believed that the UK should cut its emissions by 60% by 2050. And it calculated that the cost to the UK economy of doing that in 2050 might be 2%. In 2008, we believed that the target should be minus 80%, and we calculated that the cost of achieving that might be 1.5%. In the latest CCC, Climate Change Committee report, they've worked out what the cost of getting to zero by 2050 would be, and the cost is about 1 to 1.5%. So we now believe that the cost of getting to zero is considerably less than the cost of getting to 60% reduction looked like 20 years ago. And these costs coming down, indeed, let me be clear, once we get to 2050, this will probably be cost less. Because what happens is the very process of committing to these reductions induces technological change and innovation, which brings the cost down. So let me end there. I have an optimistic point of view that we can do it. I haven't talked about the public policies required, but we still need subsidies to drive the initial development of the hydrogen technologies. We need carbon prices in particular in the heavy industry sectors, we need regulation, but technologically we can do it. And that's great news because we absolutely have to do it, because as Bill says, at the moment, we are still warming this planet at a quite dangerous pace. Thank you.
Wonderful, Adair. Thank you very, very much. Those are very inspiring words. Also raise all sorts of questions that we'll follow up over Q&A, particularly about the policies that are quite immediately required. Let's move to Japan, to Naoko Ishii, for the perspective from there, following Prime Minister Suga's surprise announcement of the 2050 target.
Right. Yeah. So let me start with where we are in Japan. I think that there is no secret that Japan was lagging behind in decarbonization efforts even before Fukushima tragedy. And we are considered to be a coal-addicted country, together with some East Asian neighbors. Even we have received some fossil fuel award at the COP. But that has changed dramatically since that the Prime Minister Suga announced its commitment to achieve the net zero by 2050 in last October, actually in his first policy speech at the parliament since he's elected as Prime Minister. And Bill already said to share my feeling that it was honestly out of blue. Not everybody expected that kind of announcement, and we were still trying to fully understand where that announcement comes from, but that is not today's topic. That announcement has totally changed the landscape in Japan. Since then, the government, but I have to, it's mostly METI, Ministry of Economy and Trade, METI has pushed the business sector to come up with options, technological ways to achieve net zero by 2050. And actually business has been responding very enthusiastically that what are the kind of technical the options that way forward they may think with some price tag. So it's always a part of the conversation is how much it costs and the investment, but what kind of support they need, either through public policy, the subsidies or R&D, so that there is a lot of discussion ongoing. And it's actually really interesting how overnight that announcement changed the landscape about decarbonization, and it clearly demonstrated how important it is that government presents its long-term view. So that is maybe my first point. Let me now move on to what are the policy priorities from maybe Japanese point of view. Well, I'm so happy to see this, that the landscape has been changing, a lot of interesting discussion ongoing. But from my personal viewpoint, there are three areas still needs to be explored. The first, the current discussion have mostly focused on the potential energy source mix, say that how much renewable energy will be, how much still needs to be filled by maybe coal, and what's the role of nuclear, which is really a sensitive political discussion, and it really excites the community. So you have seen a lot of discussion about the potential energy source mix. But what are you really missing from the conversation, the discussion is what kind of system transformation we may want to see, particularly in 2050. The starting point, in my view, should be more about what kind of world, the society and the economy we want to have in 2050. How would be our the production and consumption system? Could we do it more circular, and could we our to make our, let's say, cities be much more sustainable, that how we can make our food system, which produced quite a lot of GHG, to be more sustainable. So there are quite a number of system change discussion, which I think it's important, but still kind of missed. And then when we think about the reason we try to decarbonize our economy by 2050 is because that our current economic system collide with the carrying capacity of the Earth system. that then how we want to change our economic model seems to be very, very important. But in Japan, it's not really at the center of the discussion yet. The second area I think that we would like to see more is a time scale and sense of urgency. If we start that in 2050, let's decarbonize by 2050, that people tend to think that it's quite 30 years from now, that there are a lot of time to think. But in fact, that the scientists make it extremely clear to get the 2050 zero carbon, that and if they do the backcasting and the scenario analysis, next 10 years is extremely crucial. So that it really dictates that if we can be successful by 2050, of what we will do in next 10 years. So this sense of timeline, 2030 and 2050, even if we aim at 2050, the next 10 years is crucial. So incremental approach just to push that something available as of today doesn't really get us to the 2050 net zero. So that's my second thing I would like to do to see in the current discussion. The third one is actually already mentioned by Adair and also Bill, that we need to recognize this and the technological solution that is really moving so fast. That we need to recognize the markets tipping points are moving very, very fast, as already mentioned by both of you. And according to the Paris Effect report, which is published by Systemic, and I think that both Adele and I endorsed that report, actually showed that the 70% of the GHG that could be addressed through cost-effective solution by 2030. So how we could really utilize that kind of, fully understand and utilize that kind of technological progress seems very, very important. And on that issue, I really want my Japanese business colleague that let's keep our eyes wide open, otherwise we would be left uncompetitive. So these are three things I would like to see in terms of policy discussion. But all of this actually made me think and made me wonder if it's a good time for us Japanese to study seriously the role played by a climate change committee, which provides that the science-based advice to the parliament and the nationals. And knowing Adair, you are the inaugurating chairman of that committee, I'm extremely interested in that that your experience. And also I understand that the committee is the product of Climate Change Act, Climate Change Law. That how come the politicians made that law and passed the law passed at the parliament with national support? It's a little bit inconceivable from Japanese point of view. So that would be my actually question for the discussion. I just want to ask Bill that do I still have time of 2 minutes, or I already exhausted my time?
No, you are exactly 2 minutes before the end of your time.
Okay. All right, so let's focus on 2 minutes, and I want to talk about my expectation of the Glasgow COP, which you are there, your country hosts. 4 things I'd like to see at the Glasgow COP. 1, please make sure that underpin the newcomer like Japan not to retreat. So creating this positive, supporting feedback and ambition slope is extremely important. Second, I'd like to see that to promote this system transformation, particularly aviation, the shipping, which you already mentioned, and also internationally traded but difficult to abate sector like cement or steel or chemicals, that how that this mission possible partnership, kind of multi-stakeholder partnership could support this system transformation. And I think the COP should actually provide that kind of opportunity. The third one, carbon tax and the cost border adjustment, so that we can increase the international investment in carbon reduction and removal. I think particularly I'm interested in if we can apply that to nature, a nature-based solution, because it provides a quite chunk of the carbon reduction. So let me stop here. I think I exhausted my 2 minutes. I can come back on my long list of COP26, but over to you, Bill and Adele.
Thank you very, very much, Naoko. That was wonderful. And particularly, I appreciate the point that you've made that the next 10 years are very crucial for this change if one is to realize these ambitions for 2050, that it's not something that can be done in the 2040s. It's really crucial for now. We'll move to questions. I want to just ask each of you, just to give a picture from each of your countries. I mean, we see in every country there is two groups in a way that fire against each other. One is climate deniers or skeptics versus those who believe, climate believers. And secondly, there are industrial lobbies, those who are in favor of green policies and those who want to lose from them. And I wonder if you could give me give us a short kind of depiction of what you think the balance is in your country on that. I mean, from your point of view, Naoko, let's start with you. I read about the motor industry protesting about electrification in Japan. How strong is the resistance currently?
So that among the general public, it is quite puzzling to me, because depending on the source of the survey, you get a very different view on that the climate change. While I see the very maybe a limited number of people who deny the climate change, but if you just ask the question about how important it is in your life, they usually climate change scored very low. So until very recently, so the sense of the priority or awareness or the sense of urgency among general public was not there until very, very recently, when we hit by extreme weather events. The industrial side is a totally different story. As I mentioned in my opening, that until Prime Minister's out of blue declaration, business doesn't want to really discuss that and the decarbonization effort, while some enlightened business leaders, usually not established companies, actually talk a lot about it. But the established business leaders, the companies, actually hesitate not to really go deep into that conversation. And until very recently, there is a strong lobby about resistance to carbon tax, even discussion of the carbon tax. It has completely changed by Prime Minister's announcement, so that something which they couldn't really associate become all of a sudden it's something they need to associate with. So I do not want to go into this the deep psychological impact, but on surface, just the one signal from top leadership completely changed this payoff structure among industrial lobby. Back to you.
Thank you. It's a very good snapshot. Adair, what would be your little snapshot of the balance of opinion in the UK and where you are?
I think in the UK, we do have some climate deniers, but they're small in number and they're not very influential. It's interesting, when the Climate Change Act went through Parliament in 2006, it actually went through by, I think it was 480 votes to 3. There were only 3 people, and I've got a little list of who they were who voted against. And what is interesting is, although British politics has changed, we've got more of this sort of, Eurosceptic wing, including some people who might have been a bit sympathetic to Mr. Trump until he went a bit too far. On the whole, that is often combined with climate change denial, but it's pretty weak. And what has been interesting is that the leadership of the Conservative Party, although it has moved on Europe, has continued to be very strong on climate change. And it's clearly a major objective of this government from the Prime Minister down. And so if there are deniers, they have to be silent. So the denial problem is not a major problem. On the industry lobby point, now, let's be clear, UK has less heavy industry than Japan. So in a sense, given that, decarbonising heavy industry is one of the difficult bits, in a sense, it's been easier for the UK to say we'll decarbonise in Japan. On the other hand, what's interesting, Europe has lots of heavy industry, and within the ETC, We work extensively now with the European steel industry, and they are all committed to be zero carbon by 2050. Their key concern, and this links to Naoko's point about border carbon adjustments, their key concern is everybody else going to do the same? Because in our Mission Possible report, we pointed out this fundamental point. It will probably cost us something to decarbonize steel. It may mean that steel will cost 20% more per ton to use steel. But at the level of the end consumer, that's not a problem, because that will only add 0.5% to the cost of a car, the cost of a washing machine, etc. But for the individual steel company, that extra 20% price, again, is not a problem as long as all of their other competitors face it, but it is if they face it and others don't. And so what we now have, I think, across the whole of the European heavy industry is actually quite strong support for carbon taxes, as long as they are combined with border carbon adjustments applied to any other country which doesn't have equivalent carbon taxes. And I do think this is going to be an important debate at COP26, where we would like in the EU ETC to get together the global steel industry. We already have ArcelorMittal, we have Tata, we are beginning to talk with Nippon Steel and other Japanese ones. And with Baowu Steel in China. We would like the whole global steel industry jointly to say to the governments of US, UK, European Union, China, Korea, and Japan, please introduce a carbon tax at a roughly equal level across all of our countries, because if you do that, we can do the right thing in decarbonizing steel without worrying about our competitive position. And I think this is going to be an interesting discussion at Glasgow this year.
That is very crucial. I can see that, and particularly where the possibility of, as it were, a positive engagement between China and the United States on an issue like this would be rather an important constructive contributor. Can I ask, I mean, coming on to our questions, our member Andrew Fraser has asked about, should we introduce a carbon tax for all sorts of fuels? How widely, so my question is, how widely can and should a carbon tax be used? There is this issue of the trade effects of it that Adair has just been talking about. There's also the question, which was behind the Gilets jaunes protests, of well, I'm paying everything, but where is my benefit? And a sense of what's the money used for? What's the best way? How widespread should it be, and what's the recommendation for how should it be sold to consumers and to households? Let's start with Adair.
Well, I think it should be widespread, but governments need to be intelligent about the distributional consequences. What happened in France was the government wasn't intelligent about it at all. First of all, the diesel price increase, which they were introducing in the course of just 16 months of both the tax and what was happening to the crude oil price, was going to increase the price of diesel by about 20%. And of course, a whole load of people in rural France said, it's okay for you, the government in Paris, to say, well, you know, buy an electric car, but the electric car ranges are now perfectly good for somebody living in the middle of Paris, but they're not good for me in rural France. So it was too fast and it was too early in the process. There was just an unintelligence about thinking it through. Let me give you another example of that. In the UK, one of the most difficult areas to decarbonize in the UK is going to be residential heat. Indeed, if you look at the Climate Change Committee's reports, they essentially say most of the economy is relatively straightforward. We're left with three tricky sectors: residential heat, aviation, and agriculture. The problem with residential heat is the UK has a lot of very badly insulated buildings, and we use gas. I think we will have to have an imposition of a carbon tax on residential gas, which encourages people to insulate their houses better and to buy electric heat pumps. But I think we will have to realize that whereas it's reasonable to say to me or to Bill, you're paying more for your gas, you put into your pocket and pay for that improvement, when you get to around the bottom third of the income distribution, it's just not okay for them to demand that they meet that. So I think we've got to be clever about taking the revenues from, let's say, a carbon tax on residential gas use and using it to subsidize the lower income groups who can't be expected out of their own pocket to invest in the heat pumps and the improvements in insulation required. So yes, we need to use carbon prices, I think, in quite a wide-ranging fashion, but we've got to think through in advance what distributional consequences that will have, and to think through what offsetting measures we can take to manage those consequences.
Thank you. Naoko, how does that look in a question look in Japan and from the point of view of the Japanese consumer?
Actually, there was a resistance to carbon tax, not necessarily from consumer point of view, it's more from industrial sector point of view. Some of the industries that the business felt that that they are singled out to bear the unfair burden of the carbon tax. But then the answer or response to that kind of question would be that how we could really measure that the source of the carbon along the value chain, the supply chain across the sectors, and so how to come up with a more standardized LCA, the life cycle assessment of the carbon, and is it possible for us to really tax along that kind of LCA, which goes across the various industries that along the value chain. And so that is maybe more a question for maybe Adair may know better than I do. So that is one. And then after that, it can be combined with that kind of income, the compensation measures for the poorest and poorest of the poor kind of thing. But this is actually my long-term question that maybe if I may ask Adair, what do you think of that?
Well, there are always two ways to try and impose a carbon tax. One involves complicated life cycle analysis. You know, did this car include carbon in it? Another way is just to go upstream and say, if I put the carbon tax on coal, on oil, and on gas, you know, that will flow down the value chain, and it will have whatever is the appropriate influence all the way down it. And I think on the whole, we should keep it simple by just imposing these taxes at the fossil fuel level, and then allowing the process of the market to say, well, embedded within that car is a bit of steel, embedded within which there is a coking coal. But as long as the coking coal cost had been increased, you know, you will have achieved the economic impact. So I think there is quite a lot to be said for going upstream in some of these carbon tax approaches.
I see. Yeah, no, that was a point to be is kind of being discussed currently in Japan, which way we should go to, and then the strong resistance with the fear really comes from those upstream industries, which may feel that they are singled out and couldn't really cross,
it's very interesting in economic theory, which you know, I know Bill will see this immediately. Of course, industries, when they are told to pay a carbon tax, often say you're imposing that on me. But if you have a reasonably competitive economy, you're really imposing it on the end consumer. Let's be clear. If we impose a carbon tax on steel production, it will eventually mean that steel is more expensive, and that a car is more expensive, and a washing machine is more expensive. And the good news is that when you run it down to that level, the total impact on consumer expenditure is absolutely trivial when you get it down to the end consumer price level.
Yeah, so you think that this is more about the psychological and the political program rather than economic
Well, I think the good news, as you said, Naoko, is that and it's intriguing what you said about the change of attitude in Japan, and I could have completely predicted this. From the moment I heard Mr. Suga's statement, I thought, okay, you are now going to have steel companies who, I met them in Japan, in Tokyo in February, who at that stage were saying, it's all very difficult, we can't do it, maybe we can decarbonize by 2070, this will cost us. Once the government has said, it's non-negotiable, it's 2050, they will be saying, how do we do it? You know, what is the technological route and what are the instruments? And once they start doing that, you could well see them swinging around to be supporters, because they will end up saying, we'd rather have a carbon price as long as it applies to everybody, rather than a set of specific regulations that get in the way of how exactly I get to net zero. So once you have a top level target, you often generate industrial support for a carbon tax, which wasn't there before.
It does.
So
your point, though, about the border adjustment starts to become pretty important.
It becomes important.
That to me would be the sort of boundary question. Let's just whip through some of the questions from our members. I mean, one a simple question really from Martin, our member Martin Barrow, which is a statement. Would you not agree that a key issue is the need to provide the public and business with clear, simple messages on the priorities? Which really the question is, how can that be done when there is a lot of complexity in the regulation and so forth? How simple can it be? What is the communication task? Adair, start with you.
Well, look, I tried to hint at it in my presentation. And it's something that I've increasingly understood over the years. At the core of it is electrification. The world currently uses electricity for about 25% of our final energy demand. By mid-century, that should be 60 or 65%. And we should be getting another 10 or even 15% of our final energy demand from hydrogen. There will be a role for carbon capture and storage with some ongoing use of fossil fuels. There will be a role for bioenergy, but the core of this is a new industrial revolution of deep electrification, and it will give all sorts of benefits because electricity is a wonderful technology. It is silent and pollutionless at the point of use. It can make our cities more attractive and pleasant places when we've no longer got hot, smelly fossil fuel companies, vehicles going around. This is the absolute core of what we have to do. And that means that the single most important thing that governments have to do is support the big development and decarbonization of their electricity system. And that to me is one of the most important messages. It's gradually grown on for me on the years that is the case. And by the way, just one thing to make you feel happy. It's the IEA point that Bill mentioned about solar is now the cheapest energy. Solar is also effectively close to limitless. The sun shines down on the Earth each day 8,000 times as much energy as the entire human residential corporate energy industrial system use. We only need to capture and use 1/8,000th of that, and we have a complete energy system, even if we didn't do all the other things of wind, etc. We are going to move by the late 21st century into an environment where energy will not only be clean, it will ultimately be cheap. It'll be quite cheap compared with today. And I think this is a very exciting possibility, which should mobilize us. And though there are costs to be faced, let me give you one example. We're going to have to pay more for aviation flights. I don't know how to decarbonize aviation without having more expensive jet fuel. We can technologically do it, but it'll be more expensive. But across the whole economy, it's relatively cheap. And there are many areas where it's going to be cheaper than it is today. So that's my big message, which I think we ought to be able to capture people's imagination with.
Now, I've got a British question about nuclear, which I'm going to ask Naoko to answer, because nuclear is such an important issue in Japan. The question is about in Britain, the industrially dying nuclear sector, trying to find itself a lifeline by arguing its new solar plants, small modular nuclear plants, could be used as co-producers of green hydrogen. So the question to you, Naoko, is what is the future? Is there a future for nuclear within this? But is there anything related to hydrogen within that? Do you give credibility to that? And is that politically feasible?
Well, I can't really, I simply am not an expert on this hydrogen and the nuclear thing. I will give it to maybe Adele if he really knows the technical answer to it. I can only talk about the discussion currently ongoing in Japan about nuclear. And as I mentioned in my opening, that we were so badly grilled, hit by a nuclear disaster in Fukushima. And then since then that it kind of, killed at least in the near future about the future of the nuclear. But in my really personal view, that is not really a technological problem. It's much more man-made that how the human being can manage the technology problem, and that's where we failed. So that if we would like to see the future of the nuclear as a part of, as a very important source of this energy provision mix, and that two things needs to happen. The one is that we need to really fully capture and the way to manage that technology, and then including safety, that operation. That's where we failed last time, and that the review of that the failure is extremely important in my personal view. We haven't really completed it yet to the extent that it gains the public support and comfort and support. The second thing is related to that point, that for Japan to go ahead with to give a sufficient place for the nuclear, that the public trust is extremely important. It's not something the government can buy money, so that how the government can engage with the general public and to give them a kind of sense of comfort and the trust and the confidence needs a lot of good work. But definitely, technically speaking, it is an important source of that energy mix.
Yeah. So here's another question. Thank you. Lawrence Green asks, both of you, the technological and economic argument is certainly convincing and inspiring, but from an infrastructural perspective, what are the immediate, relatively quick wins that we might see in the next 10 years or so that would convince the public the long-term goals are really achievable? And Richard Siva has similarly asked, really, both of you, what do you think the Japan government and the UK government should do to move faster? What are the quickish wins in the next 10 years? Adair, start with you.
Well, it's interesting to look then in the UK's that the Climate Change Committee report, what they call the 6th Carbon Budget report, which is where we need to be in 2035, about what are the things that need to be done to essentially have a close to zero carbon electricity system by then. They define that as close to below 30 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour produced by 2035 en route to zero. It's about 250 grams per kilowatt hour in the UK today. What has to happen to do that and then to use that electricity, and therefore what are the policy priorities in the next 10 years? It's one, build that electricity system, and the UK Prime Minister has committed to build 40 gigawatts of offshore wind in the North Sea by 2030. That is absolutely physically doable. The latest bids from actually autumn 2019 on our latest auction of offshore wind actually came in at £40, about $50 per megawatt hour, which is very competitive. And of course, if you make a clear commitment that you're going to have huge quantities in future, that very process tends to produce the development of value chain that brings the cost down. So the UK government will build that 40 gigawatts. They will hold auctions for that. The price will come down. That electricity will increasingly be used in electric vehicles. We have now made a commitment in the UK, being matched by other countries, that we will have no sales of internal combustion engine light duty vehicles, whether vans or cars, beyond 2030. And that is, I think, becoming an increasing focus of countries. And what that's doing is that a lot of other car manufacturers are saying, even if my government hasn't done that yet, that's what I'm going to work on. I saw a report just in the FT yesterday from the new head of Renault saying that they will sell their last internal combustion engine car sometime in the early to mid 2030s. Now, they won't be allowed to sell it in the UK, but even in the world where they are allowed to sell it, they won't do it. So one, build the electricity you need. By the way, important point not to lose sight of, think in advance what you're going to do on your transmission system and your distribution system. You can't leave that as an afterthought. You've got to have some pre-planning. You've got to let your national grid or your distribution companies invest ahead of demand. On the EV side, it's fundamentally driven by individual purchase, but there's a big thing to do on charging infrastructure. Charging infrastructure in total is a very small investment in total billions. I mean, if you compare it with the cost of building 40 gigawatts of offshore, the cost of building the charging infrastructure will be minute, but it still has to happen. You know, you've still got to have a government, you know, tell local authorities, you've got to put these in, it's got to go somewhere. It's something which in total macroeconomic terms is not a big investment, but if somebody doesn't plan and make it happen, it won't be there when people buy an electric vehicle. So those are some of the things that has to happen in the immediate future and are part of what the UK Climate Change Committee talks about, actions between now and 2030.
Naoko, what's your briefing to Prime Minister Suga about the actions to take in the next 10 years?
Right. I will advise him to be extremely clear about the vision and also the determination. For instance, Adair already mentioned that Japan in general is considered to be a little in favorable position the renewable energy because of geology and the technology. But so it gives a bit of the leeway or the justification or excuse, not just excuse, not to really look for the 100% zero electrification, carbon electrification. People tend to talk about CCU and CCS and those kind of things. So maybe the Prime Minister could tell the public that forget about those CCU, CCS, and let's just think about how you could completely decarbonize that electrification system, that you can do it, kind of message. So that's going to be number one. It's basically close this and excuse not to really explore that option to the full extent. The second thing is about, also there is a little bit of the fear and the competition among, particularly like EU cross-border taxation, adjustment taxation, those kind of things. And then and we are always kind of being left behind, and we may be in competitive stage. Those kind of feeling among Japanese and business. How you could really help them be much more, in a sense, assertive and to go into that kind of international discussion to create or co-create the future across borders, that this multi-stakeholder coalition or mission possible partnership is basically to try to bring those business leaders across borders together to create or co-create the future vision. So I'd like to push them to go into that arena rather than just staying back in Japan and to create that vision, not just for Japan, but for the future generation. That's something quite missing in Japan. I'm quite frustrated with that. So that's maybe the second thing. And the last one is, as Adair already mentioned, the idea to like to imagine how my life be changed in 2030, and how this small and little shaky apartment and I can live outside Tokyo, but commute in a very clean way and enjoy that much greener life. And so that if I come to know much clearly, not just a dream, in a very plausible way, how my life in 2030 be different from now, and it's not just the suffering or the pain, it's a really bright and beautiful future. How you can make it much more kind of plausible and kind of not just the imagination, the dream, but something possible. So I think it will change the people's and rather defensive the psychology. It was much more kind of I wouldn't say aggressive, but a positive psychology. And I just like to see it and really coming from top. So back to you.
Very good, thank you. And I hope that Prime Minister Suga can take on these tasks and we don't have to wait for the young Koizumi to become old enough to be Prime Minister. Yeah. I shouldn't say that, that's a political comment. Let me ask a question. Yokodochi has asked about the hydrogen society. Yeah. What are the UK and Japanese current blueprints on this? She agrees that it's a key to getting to zero. What are the biggest political challenges? Not many of us understand much about the hydrogen issue. Adair, give us the quick.
Well, one of the crucial things I think to understand is that I think hydrogen is going to be hugely important, even if very few people are going to be driving hydrogen cars. I think a lot of people have gone off on a sort of false start, and I do actually think this is true in Japan and with the automotive makers there, of believing that by hydrogen economy, we mean hydrogen cars. Our analysis suggests that battery electric is highly likely to beat hydrogen for almost all passenger cars. And the only people who want a hydrogen passenger car will be people who are regularly driving, 300 or 400 kilometers day after day after day. And most people don't do that. And batteries are going to get cheaper and cheaper. Electric motors are going to get better. Battery electric vehicles will be cheaper than internal combustion engine vehicles by the mid-2020s up front. I do not think there is a major role for hydrogen automobiles. On the other hand, I think hydrogen will probably be the primary vector for the decarbonization of steel production. We will move away from the use of coking coal as the reduction agent to hydrogen. We think that hydrogen turned into ammonia is the most likely way forward for the decarbonization of shipping. We think that in the long run, aeroplanes may fly on synthetic fuels synthesized out of hydrogen and CO2 from direct air capture. We think there are very major roles for hydrogen in the petrochemical area. And we think that hydrogen will probably be a crucial element within the power system as something which you create when you have surplus power, when the wind is blowing but you don't need it, and then you put back through a fuel cell to produce electricity when you need it. And the biggest problem with renewable dominated systems is not the day to night balance in electricity. That's going to be solved by batteries. But batteries are not a good technology when you're asking, what do you do in Britain in the situation that we've had for the last week, where we've had an anticyclone with low wind, no sun, and high electricity demand, but it's cold. How do you cover that? Hydrogen storage may be a major role. Put all that together, we think global hydrogen use could go from 70 million tons to 700 million tons, but with very, very little of that going into hydrogen autos. So it is crucial. The good news is that to produce hydrogen from electrolysis, only two things matter. One, the cost of your zero carbon electricity, and that's coming down, and the cost of your electrolyzer equipment. And that, we believe, is in the process of collapsing at the same pace that solar PV panels are going to collapse. We see those coming down from $850 per kilowatt to certainly $200 by the late 2020s and to $100 in the long term. And once you do that, you can produce by electrolysis very cheap hydrogen. So those are some thoughts on this hydrogen economy, which we see in the future.
I'm muted. Thank you. And I'm going to lob in a quick question also to Adair before I ask perhaps Naoko to make some final remarks, which is almost a consumer question, really. Joy Henry, one of our members, has asked, connects to your point about solar costs. She says, if the cost of solar energy has been so much reduced, how come it still requires an investment bigger than older people's lifetime to start benefiting from roof panels on a private house? In other words, is there how much of a time lag is there really before we get to that reduction from a consumer point of view, residential point of view? And what can be done about it to make it less off-putting for residents?
Well, let's be clear, the economics at residential level will always be worse than the economics at a wholesale big development level, not because of the cost of the solar panels, but because of the cost of the guy who comes and fits it, etc. And there is a limiting factor there, that the cheaper the solar panels get, the more expensive all of those costs. Having said that, this is my office at the top of my shed. It's got some solar panels on it. They're coming on Friday to produce a battery and connected. My calculations are, I mean, I'm doing something fancy with the battery because I wanted to, but the solar panels themselves cost about 4,000 quid for 10 panels that I've got here. And I think I'll get a payback from that in about 8 to 10 years, not more than a lifetime. But, you know, it will vary according to the individual circumstances and the individual cost. What we are seeing, however, at mass scale is that the costs are unbelievably low. So if you go to sunny parts of the world, to Portugal, to Chile, to Mexico, to Saudi, Qatar, Morocco, we are now seeing auctions for solar power delivery being won at $15 per megawatt hour. And when the German government was, as it were, paying Bavarian farmers to put solar panels on their roofs back in the 2000 to get this thing going, they were paying them a feed-in tariff of about $400 per megawatt hour, and it's now $15 per megawatt hour. And this is going to come down. So I think the economics for retail can be better than you're suggesting. I think there will be a big role for rooftop. I think one of the things that we should be really pushing is rooftop on commercial applications, you know, not just the 10 panels, but I think really we should be saying now to every supermarket, I would favor a regulation that just sells supermarkets. Within 10 years, you've got to have the whole of that supermarket covered with solar panels. I mean, this is, for society, it is crazy for us not to be maximizing those intermediate scale things between the residential scale and the big, you know, sort of multi-hectare field type stuff.
Absolutely. No, I can agree very, very fully with that. Now, I've run slightly over time. I'm just going to, and it's been a wonderful conversation. I'm just going to ask Naoko Ishii whether she'd like to make give us any final thoughts on the view from Japan and your expectations for the year, if you like, with COP26. You're muted. There we are.
Yeah, actually, for the last few months, what happened to Japan that really give me a hope that we can change this difficult kind of landscape, the country domestically, but also its positioning in international. That how we can team up with other enlightened leaders together to create or co-create the better future. Today's discussion, and Adele, you gave me a lot of energy to move on towards that direction. And personally, I was actually thinking while listening to Adele's last 10 minutes about the hydrogen future, I'm thinking about how maybe I need to change that plan of my new house, then how to heat it up, and then how to commute. And it really gives me quite a different kind of image of the life in, say, that even in Japan, 5 years from now. So I very much appreciate this conversation, and I hope that every one of us listening to this really give that kind of change in the perspective and feel it that it is within our reach as far as we really want to have. So that is maybe that my final thought. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Naoko Ishii, and thank you, Adair Turner, for sparing the time to be with us. It's been a very inspiring conversation, a sense that the future is within our grasp, but also that we need to encourage our governments to get these regulations in place, get these investments moving, and get the incentives right, and to follow a very clear communication system, as both of you said. Thank you again. Thank you to the audience for being with us, sending in so many excellent questions. And I look forward to seeing you all again at our next webinar. In fact, the next one of this series that we're having is about Brexit 1 month on. I think it might be less inspiring, but it'll be very important to understand where we've got to and where we're going there too. So thank you again, Adair Turner and Naoko Ishii. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.